healthy diet, does not drink much alcohol as can be argumentative when drunk, does not have a lot of family contact but would like more, states has never used drugs, okay with budgeting. So people are sometimes surprised to hear that that's how I choose to introduce myself. Yet every day this happens across the UK when someone becomes homeless. We call it a needs assessment. If we don't know your needs, how do we know how to fix you? Some of us who have experienced the system will know just how this feels. But let's just think about that for a minute. Let's reflect on how any of us would feel if we had to wake up every morning and think about presenting ourselves to total strangers to share everything we're not particularly comfortable in talking about, and maybe not just once, maybe time and time again. And that's just one aspect of being in the homeless system. In 2011, that's what we did at Mayday. Mayday was a medium-sized traditional homeless supported housing charity. We had 70 staff, £4 million turnover, offering accommodation and support across 3 regions in England. And we believed we were doing a grand job. We were getting high scores in our supporting people funding. But in 2011, I think we did something that we probably had never, ever done before. We really listened to people. We didn't ask questions. We didn't have focus groups. It wasn't by any account an academic study. We sat on park benches in hostel rooms, and then we reflected on what people had to say, and we listened to the key themes that came up time and time again. And over the last 9 years, we transformed every aspect of the organization as a result of what we heard. We didn't ask about people's symptoms. We didn't ask their needs. We didn't ask them what they thought, how we should design services. We just let people talk about their experiences of services, and we listened. And we listened to a few hundred people, and we produced this innocuous little book, which we called Wisdom from the Street. And if you click on our link on the website, it'll take you to the wisdoms. But they can be summarized into 2 points. One was, when you become homeless, the experience is at best intrusive, dehumanizing, re-traumatizing, but at worst institutionalizing. People become trapped in services. And the second thing, and this was backed up by St Andrews University data, supporting people data, the results aren't good enough. Too many people either remain in services for years or else consistently return. And it was really interesting that when we researched responses to what people were telling us, the answers we didn't find in other homeless services across the globe. There weren't the answers there that we were looking for. We find them in places like Harvard research on executive coaching or the Search Institute's positive youth work. But what we did discover was initially 3 main reasons why the current system isn't working for people when they become homeless. We focus on people's weaknesses, and yet there's this whole body of evidence that proves that if you continually focus on somebody's weakness, if you continually focus every week on support planning, then you only get so far. Personal development is limited, and sustainability of change is almost non-existent. Whereas if you build on what people are good at, if individuals have evidence that they can achieve and succeed, then internal motivation is there and change is likely to be sustained. And that's true of all of us. If we just think about when we want to make a change in our life and when is the most likely point, when are we most highly motivated, is when we're feeling good about ourselves. So what that told us very clearly was that the UK system, which is based entirely on needs, risks and deficits, is never ever going to work. And that is not only at an individual level, but a systemic level of where we're investing in deprived communities. And then we came across fixing. And fixing is the art of focusing on the problem and not the person. And this is probably the biggest barrier to people getting through tough times and to personalization. By focusing on needs, whether that is complex needs, multiple needs, dual dependency, diagnosis, we fail to get an insight and understanding into the person and the causes, connections, the social determinants, the barriers to sustaining positive change. If someone is drinking to cope with childhood trauma, working on abstinence, trying to fix their drinking is never ever going to work. Fixing doesn't work. However passionate we are to change what we perceive as people's harmful behavior, self-defeating beliefs, without that wider understanding of who that person is, we will, on most occasions, not succeed, and certainly not succeed long term. Yet everyday workers are trying to help fix people. And what we end up doing is compounding people's belief that their situation is hopeless. If a person has become institutionalized, then they've built up a whole history of repeated failure. So to sustain your tendency, you've got to give up drinking. To give up drinking, we're sending you to rehab. But your drinking is a survival strategy, so you'll fail. You'll internalize that as your own failure, and you'll have that on repeat. So that the likelihood that you'll ever change is far removed. And then we came across segregation. And segregation from everyday society impacts on our self-esteem, our values, and how we feel about our own role within community. The wisdoms told us that people only ever talk to their key worker, professionals, or other homeless people. And of course, we are all human. We want to provide that humanity to people. We are absolutely committed to the work, but we cannot solve isolation and loneliness within services. People deserve more than paid friends. But we have the homeless GP, the homeless art class, the homeless haircut. There's no core focus on developing relationships and purpose outside the homeless sector. And to integrate, for those who have spent many years, the psychological leap is too great. Yet we build up people's sense of identity, community, everything that is familiar within services. We enjoy the community gatherings, the days out, the activities. And then we say to somebody, and now we've got you flat way over there, isolated from everything and everything you know. And we're surprised when people come back, it's because they've got multiple needs. Not the fact that we have created the psychological leap that's too great for people to escape services. And more recently, since we've started working more closely with mental health services, what we've seen is pathologizing to a huge extent within the homeless sector. And as budgets are cut from local authorities and health budgets become more, health becomes more around the table, we see everything. We start to see things through the prism of mental health. So students under pressure suffer mental ill health. Women experience violence, suffer mental ill health. People who cannot afford their rent suffer mental health problems. But the solution to life's problems cannot be cured by a diagnosis or a pill. People experiencing homelessness are pathologized, labeled, and seen as complex needs. And there's endless energy put into solving these multiple problems, yet the pill has yet to be invented that provides a safe, secure home for somebody. The label often provides a convenient distraction to the lack of safe, secured, affordable housing. Labeling people as mentally ill only serves to take them further away from getting through a tough time. Our attempt to drive this truly person-led response can only be described as the most challenging, terrifying experience I've ever faced in my life over the last 9 years. It's been absolute pure hell. But our mission changed from trying to end homelessness for people with complex needs to stopping the systemic institutionalization of people in services. What we saw very clearly, and it was a hard, long journey, but what we learned was that we were part of the problem. As a homeless organization delivering supported accommodation, we had become a significant part of the problem. The system was the problem and not the people. Initially, in attempting to deliver what we thought was an asset-based approach, we discovered that we needed to change a lot more than our operating model. And I can remember it well. It was a snowy day in February in 2012. And we presented our plans to really look at listening to people and doing things differently. And we wanted to be honourable. So we said to the staff, you can either come on this journey with us, we're going to throw away everything and do something entirely new, or you can accept redundancy. And 50% of the staff at that time left. And that was absolutely terrifying for us. But it needed to happen. And throughout the journey, there was lots and lots more terrifying. We separated out support and housing. We didn't feel that people could build a trusting relationship with somebody who had the power to evict them from their housing. So we separated our support and housing, and immediately our arrears doubled. The board didn't say stop. They said, this is learning. We reflected on how key workers chase rent as opposed to support the individual. So there was fascinating learning. And in 2016, I think we had sufficient evidence by then to say that when you give women and men back power and control over their lives, some choice, and you deliver that person-led work, then there is really instant results. People do get it and get on with their life. Not everybody, because some workers and people in the system are as institutionalized. But when we decided in 2016 that we were going to do this and we weren't going to do anything, it meant really radical changes internally. We had to hand back a 5-year mental health contract because that didn't fit with our seeing people as people and not labels. We sold a 1.5 million mental health facility and moved out of Warwickshire and Bedfordshire. We've been for over 30 years, but commissioners there wouldn't allow us to deliver person-led, strength-based work. Our turnover reduced to £2 million. We invested 1.6 million of our own reserves at a time of austerity when lots of charities were battling down the hatches and not spending any money. We invested a huge amount just to follow a response to what people were saying. The board, there was 100% board turnover. We expected the board to take a much higher level of risk, and our culture moved entirely from a performance culture to continually learning and adapting. And I'd like to say the sort of changes stopped there, but the changes didn't stop. And although the scale was hugely significant internally, this was just the beginning. We went to work in Oxford. Oxfordshire say, yes, we're up for some innovation. We're up for doing things differently. But when we got into Oxford and we started to deliver that person-led work, we were very much upset in the state, unintentionally, we were upset in the status quo. And one of the examples is that when we did manage to get a contract with the County Council for Supported Housing, we became very quickly a failing contract. And that was really, really scary. But we couldn't produce the percentage of people that we referred to drug and alcohol services. Our mental health assessments wasn't high enough. And that's because people were choosing to go to visit museums and art galleries and join chess clubs and reduce their drinking by getting out of the sector and finding mates who are doing activities in non-wraparound services. So when people were actually given the choice, they didn't want more and more services in their life. What they wanted to be free from services, which was an absolute eye-opener for us. So we said, and still do to this day, we aren't a failing contract in Oxford. It's how we're being measured. What we learned through many years of trying to deliver an asset-based approach was it cannot truly work within this system. So all of the organizations that say they deliver strength-based work, I would challenge them to say, can you really truly do that when you're working within such a deficit-based system? The person-led, transitional, strength-based approach that we evolved isn't a model, it isn't an innovation, and it's certainly not an intervention. It's very simply a response to just listening to people. Thank you.
So listening, we're not so good at that. I am Robert, I work for Mayday Trust, but in a former life, I was the lead commissioner for supported housing and rough sleeper strategy at Westminster City Council. And what that meant, well, first of all, meant I'd made up my own job title, but what it also meant was I was responsible for working alongside a team of people to try and make sure that the right interventions were in the right place for the right people at the right time. And we were really good, I thought. We used to put some incredible innovations in place. We used to respond really quickly. There were thousands of people who would come through the streets of Westminster every year, and there weren't thousands of people living on the street. So it felt like we were moving in the right direction. And it felt like we were doing all we could, but something else was at play that meant that we could never reduce rough sleeping down to the levels we needed it to be, or we could never reduce the amount of people that were revolving around the supported housing pathways that we'd created. A lot of people had complex needs, and that's what we kept telling ourselves, and that's what we kept telling everybody that wanted to know why things weren't working, was because people had problems and we were trying our best to fix them, but some people just couldn't be fixed. Some people didn't want to come off the street. And lots of different things we'd tell ourselves and tell everybody that would listen. And essentially all it boiled down to was that we were always doing what we could to blame the individual, to let them internalize the failure so that we didn't have to hold the mirror up to ourselves. The system isn't really geared up to hear feedback from people. We did some bits, we did a bit of co-production, we did a little bit of listener groups and a little bit of focus work and tried to gather what people told us. But ultimately, if they told us something was wrong, we would probably look for a reason as to why we couldn't fix that. Or we'd revert back to our old friend, blaming back on them, that their ideas were unrealistic or they didn't really know what they were talking about. And all that really served to do was that we'd never particularly evolve. In 2018, a light bulb moment for me, we had worked really hard to reduce street count numbers. And for those that don't know, every year, local authorities are expected to submit a number to central government, which is their street count. And in Westminster, it was always very, very high, always in the hundreds, certainly from my time there, and before me as well, I'd hasten to add. In 2017, we found 217 people. And then the RSI had started, the Rough Sleepers Initiative, which meant that after we'd taken £2 million out of the system, the RSI had come along to put a few million back into it. And essentially, they'd come to us to say, do what you need, here's a blank check, we must get these numbers down. So we worked really hard to try and double the size of our night centre to provide more beds, or we put some more people in our mental health team to be able to assess more people. And we increased service capacity so that everything was absolutely at its limit. And we invested nearly £500,000 in a couple of months back into the system, all gearing up to this night in November 2018 to get us from 217. We wanted to get below 200, just to show that it was worth investing, worth sticking some money back in the system, because then numbers would reduce. We found 333 people that night. And despite investing time, energy, and money into the system, things weren't improving. People weren't coming inside. And it was at that point that we started to realize that systems change was vital. And system change means different things to different people. System change can be people that are sort of within the system trying to make it a bit better wherever they can. And essentially, there's a lot of survival within the system that we know. And more and more we see that homeless organisations do what they can to remain relevant and survive and make sure that year after year there's a cause to keep fighting. There's systems change which solely focuses on government policy. If only government would change this, then all would be well. Well, time and time again, we see that that doesn't seem to have the impact that we hope it will. And then there's sort of systems change that looks at innovation, tweaking the system, making it better. We need more joined up talking. We need less barriers. We need better referral forms, better referral processes. And that innovative sort of innovation within systems, again, seems to time and time again prove that it's not enough. It doesn't seem to have the impact that we need it to have. Now, there's no question, as Pat said, that it's well-intentioned and people are trying their best. And there's no question for me that services now are much better than they were 5, 10, 15 years ago. But we're still in a position where there are hundreds of people on the streets and there are thousands more people revolving around services. So I started to look at what could be different, and I was already well aware of Mayday, but it was something that I started to invest more energy into, more learning into, and fast forward 2 years later, and I finally managed to land a job with the organisation that really looks at what we're searching for within systems change, which is that paradigm shift, a genuine functional shift away from what we're doing. And the PTS response that Pat talked about, and the simplicity of just listening to people, is really where our focus needs to be. It's really hard, though, and seeing questions already appearing. Lots of people agree with the idea that things aren't quite right, but how do we make that shift? We identify something within our listening called the deficit system. The idea that there's interconnecting cogs in all the different areas that ultimately are feeding into the idea of this deficit focus. What's wrong with you? How many complex needs do you have? Even organisations that are looking to shift that and taking funding from different areas will still try and define people. You've got 2 or more of the 4 categories that identify you as the most complex. And then if you're the most complex, we'll funnel you into this new system and you'll get this offer. And it still serves to label and identify people by what's wrong with them, and never particularly looking at what they can contribute, what they want to contribute, what their strengths and what their assets are. Commissioning was my bag, and commissioning had a real key part within that deficit system. Governments would identify pots of money at random times, and they would offer that money to local authorities through localism, and local authorities would try and pull down that funding into different streams, whether it be mental health or rough sleeping or young people leaving care, whatever the label might be. Maybe you've just left prison, maybe you're a victim of domestic abuse, and we'll try and make sure we create those silos, and then we'll develop contracts, pretty good contracts, I always thought, pretty good specifications around those, and then we'll invite providers to tell us why they think they can do it the best. and people start to game for those resources, ultimately telling us what we want to hear, and we start to move around this system of complicity, knowing that things aren't quite right, but it's kind of the best that we can do at the moment. And at the end of it, you've got an individual who is ultimately segregated from society entirely and is only identified by the fact that they are homeless, or the fact that they have just left prison, or the fact that they're a victim of abuse. And as they revolve around that system and we try and move them towards the idea of being independent and free from services, we wonder why that doesn't work, and they're completely attached to the idea of needing input throughout their lives. That can be seen a lot if you look at the homelessness system as we know it, whether it be mental health or physical health. It's the art of fixing that Pat talked about. It's the idea that we've got to patch people up and send them on their way. Mental health can be so situational, particularly if you're going through such tough times as not having a roof over your head, or leaving prison, or whatever that might be. And then physical health is a really fascinating one. We spent a huge amount of time in conversations at the local authority with CCG colleagues, with health colleagues, with GPs, trying to work out what we could do to provide homeless health services, tailored services for individuals, so that they could access the health that they need. When really we weren't looking at why people weren't accessing those health services in the first place, and what was it about the mainstream, for want of a better term, that was preventing people going and accessing those. And there's been some great initiatives. Groundswell have done some fantastic work at trying to ensure that people access their rights and access health when at the point at which they need it, anywhere that they do need it. And it's that kind of system thinking that we've got to say, let's not create something new that just sort of patches up this issue over here. We've got to confront what's in front of us and push for that system change. It's a big task, and there's no question that it's a long game. I'm in a very, very fortunate position working at Mayday that I can attend these things and talk about what we see as some of the challenge. But what can we do if we're in it? What can we do if we want to make a difference within an organisation, but perhaps are beholden to contracts or outcomes monitoring or fairly meaningless data which doesn't really tell us anything? So I wanted to just give a few minutes just to talk about what's available to you guys to get involved if this kind of stuff sounds interesting. You can join us. We're just entering into this week. We're launching the New System Alliance. And what that is a collective of organisations that feel the same way that we do. And we're hosting a number of conversations this week, which goes into a bit more detail about what systems change can be, what it means for people, and what the challenges are that present when we're trying to focus on this as an issue. And Rosie's put the link in the chat. Please do sign up for some of those conversations, because the more we talk about it, the more we can call it out. And there's safety in numbers. So if we're all saying it, then someone's got to listen. But the most important thing is about listening to the people that we're working alongside and trying to respond, trying to hear what people are saying rather than hearing what we want to hear, and trying to implement things on a very, very local, individual level, as well as some of those bigger systems conversations. There is a lot of things that people can do individually, but there's even more that people can do collectively. And we're really interested in trying to explore what's possible when things are commissioned in a different way, when funding is looked at in a different way, when data is considered in a different way. And ultimately, where does it leave the individual who is going through a tough time? Where does it leave them, and what's available to them? So keep following what Mayday are doing. Thank you very much for listening to Pat and I talk about it. There's an opportunity, I think, for some questions, but that's it from us.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Robert. So quite a few questions in the chat. I'm going to come to one of the more recent questions first. If you were to go back into being a commissioner, Robert, what would be the 3 things you'd take with you?
Well, number one has to be about how we truly listen to what people are telling us, and how we provide the right space for people to be able to articulate what they want. I'd remove all competitive commissioning and create a much more an environment where people can articulate what they're learning, so that we can adapt and develop mechanisms to make sure that we're providing things for people when they want them. And I'd shut all of the hostels and all of the support accommodation because I'd want to make sure that people had what they wanted. And I've never asked anybody what they want, and they've said, please put me in a big hostel. So they'd go to.
Thank you. Pat, I'm going to throw this one to you. And there's a few questions in the chat about measurements and recording and evidencing. And I just wonder sort of what your thoughts on that. So you talked really eloquently and the way you spoke was incredibly powerful. And there's lots of agreement that this is the right approach, but how, when we're in a system that is pretty fixated on how many mental health referrals, how many substance use referrals, and so on, how do you measure outcomes and impact?
So my initial response, and up until a few weeks ago, my only response would be that we replaced the current measuring tools and things like Recovery Star and Outcome Star. And we worked with the Search Institute in America that have developed what they call a developmental asset survey. And this is a survey that's been used across the globe. It's been used widely with youth, and we adapted it to work with people experiencing homelessness. And it was the only tool that we found that actually measures people's strengths. And it measures people's internal strengths, their resilience, their sense of identity, and it measures their external assets, so social competency, the friendships, their access to learning. And what really appealed was that those of us are old enough and to read Jackie magazine, it was very much like a psychometric test. So there wasn't any, what do you drink? It was all about, do you enjoy reading? And so it's a very quick survey, but actually it produces empirical data. So it's not the subjective, how you doing on your drinking and your family contact. There's no way to cheat it. And we worked with Search to be able to present it just very much like the Outcome Star. But what was really, really, really interesting is that we've got 5 years of data, and and people always say, oh, we work with the hardest to reach and the most complex needs. And when you look at the Search data and what it produces and look at people's scores in terms of the assets and the strengths that people have, and particularly the siloed cohort of complex needs, you get a very, very different view of people. So we run that alongside the wellbeing scale, the WENWEBs, so the Warwickshire and Edinburgh mental health scale. And it's been really, really interesting that very much correlates. So we've got much, much stronger evidence and robust evidence that's much more empirical than the subjective data that is absolutely meaningless. If you reduced somebody's offending, if you improve somebody's emotional well-being, what the hell do you mean? You can't compare one organization to the next. Whereas for our PTS, we've worked with 9 organizations across England, and now more recently in Scotland, we've got coaches up there who we can compare apples with apples. So we've got a whole profile of, well, what sort, that how many people are actually have got high scores who could move out of their situation very quickly. How many people, and we can really, really benchmark people in a much more robust way than we ever could before. But can I just make a little point, is that very recently, before leading up to the launch of the New System Alliance, we did what we call wisdom from the system, and we had conversations with people working and living, experiencing the system. And one of the things that came from that was that if we are going to really do systems change, It's not about replacing the existing cogs. If you listen to people and build a system based on what people say, it will look much more like a therapy model where a therapist sits in front of somebody and is accountable to that person, not to somebody who's paying the bill. And just that little thing of systems change as we talk about it currently is about replacing the existing cogs, and that's not far enough. And you've only got to listen to the hundreds of people that we listen to in Wisdom from the System to know we're on hiding. You know, we thought we were doing a great job. You know, we'd discovered search, we'd got this really strength-based tool, but you're still distorting when you're trying to measure. And somebody mentioned Toby Lowe's human learning systems. There's lots of work, as Robert said, there's no quick fix to this. But what we've got to be really clear collaboratively together is that we're solving the right problem, and replacing the existing cogs isn't good enough. We've got to be even more radical. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
Absolutely fine, Pat. It's a great answer. Just picking up, I suppose, taking you right back to the beginning, what actually was the catalyst for you and Mayday to actually start this journey?
Well, I would like to say that we saw that things were wrong, but I'd be very honest and say I was appointed at a time of austerity to look at mergers and acquisitions. And so we said that it wasn't just a rainy day, it was climate change. So we were 100% state funded. We were staring, as many organizations still are, looking at survival. And I was wined and dined to look at mergers. And we just took one last look about what will happen to people in the new world when all of this contract money goes. And we decided to do something different. So, you know, we say that mission wasn't the initial starting point, but it certainly became it later on.
Cool, thank you. Robert, I'm going to ping these to you. And so quite a few questions or comments in the chat about sort of reflections on COVID. So I wonder if you've got, I've managed to spotlight both of you. Brilliant. I can stop the rest of the faffing around. Yeah, I suppose your reflections on COVID and sort of the impact of that mass everyone in accommodation. There's also, I suppose, linked to that, a bit of an ethical question about if somebody says they really don't want help, and they, you know, actually, what's the ethical considerations around that if they're likely to freeze on the streets? Which kind of links to a point about, as a strengths-based organisation, how do you fit in a deficit-based system? So people have to fit a box, have to demonstrate whatever level of need in order to get housing or benefits or whatever. Just wonder if you could reflect on that for us.
Yeah. Okay. So COVID first of all. Yeah, reflections from that. So I was still at Westminster when lockdown 1 hit, and it was manic. We had been given some fairly vague advice, I think it's probably fair, from central government to just say, this has got a reputation of disaster written all over it. Please, can you make sure there isn't people on the street whilst we're locking down everything else? And we generally focused on what can we do to quickly get people out of the picture. So the hotel everyone in piece of work was a very successful way of making sure that people weren't on the streets, and also a very successful way of blaming people when they didn't take it, because how can you refuse such a beautiful hotel room? So if anybody was left on the street, we could easily say, well, there's just no helping some people. And I will come to the no helping some people question in a moment. Everyone in had its merits. It wasn't, you know, what it did was demonstrate that it is possible to do things differently. It is possible to release money. It is possible to be nice to each other and work together on things without an agenda and without an ego, and it is possible to provide things for people when they want them. But we have to remember that whilst everybody did, or not everybody certainly, and certainly don't believe the 90% suggestion, but lots of people went into hotels when lockdown 1 hit, but everybody was terrified. Everybody, well, nobody knew anything about what was happening, and nobody knew how severe or not it was. So the acceptance rate of people going into hotels was very, very high. Also, though, if you provide a space for people that's individual to them, self-contained, you might say, and unconditional, to the point that you know, all things like no recourse was forgotten about, then the take-up is higher. And it's really important that we learn that when you start taking conditions away and provide something that people want, then the take-up does remarkably get much higher. So there were positives to that, but what COVID's taught us as a society is that nobody likes being told what to do. And so we still got to revert back to managing people's lives and fixing people's situations, and not really asking them what they wanted. And that was so much the case, and easily dealt with at Westminster or any other local authority. I shouldn't just say it's happening in Westminster. We didn't need to ask people what they wanted, because it was a pandemic, it was a rush, we must get people in. Unfortunately, when these things happen, although luckily these mass international pandemics don't happen all the time, we do revert back to controlling and managing people, and making sure they do. And really the question will be, what happens next? What conversations do we have with people, and what do we provide for people? Because a huge amount of people were moved from hotels back into hostel spaces and pathways that they were never going to go to in the first place. So that can be really difficult as well. And we need to take a longer view on the impact of something like everyone in, and not suggest that it was the silver bullet that's been searched for. Answering the question about what we do if we're strength-based and somebody requires a mental health act assessment or a mental capacity assessment, we're not suggesting we get in the way of those statutory interventions. But what our PTS response is all about is working with the individual to highlight what the system has done in order to put them in the position that they're in. What's happened to you, and how can we work with you to highlight what systemic issues around you have caused this situation that you're in. We don't want to advise people to stop taking medication or ignore their diagnosis and completely disengage from statutory services, but it's just about reframing and reframing the lens for people so that they better understand that the situation they're in is for a variety of reasons, and we're not internalizing that blame. I think there was a third point you wanted to raise as well.
No, I think you've covered it really, because I think it's a person-centered approach, isn't it? It's all of this can sit alongside statutory interventions. So I think about, we've done some work with Rosie in particular, who's with us this evening, with people in secure mental health settings. And quite a few of those take a really asset-based, strength-based approach to people's recovery. And they're supported to move on into environments that they've chosen, that with the support that they want, and sometimes that they don't want, but that's part of their mental health act assessment. So it is possible to do that in a very person-centered and asset-based way. I want to come to Pat. So Pat, we spoke, it seems like years ago, but it wasn't actually, it was only a few months ago. And you told me the story of somebody that you'd connected with who was an artist. And I just wondered if you might briefly share that story with people.
So our response is that coaches, or sometimes called system activists, work alongside people and try to reconnect them with and give opportunity to do what you're good at. And this young guy was a absolutely terrific artist. That's what he loved. And what he was getting was continual referrals to painting and decorating. So we have this, we don't use sort of employment placements, but we do have personal budgets, and we also are not limited by money, because there's lots of people out there that want to give you lots of money if it's for, you know, if it's for the individuals. So the amount of the course that this young guy wanted to go on was at the London School of Fashion and Design, and you know, he had researched it, he wanted to go on it anyway. Long story short, we got him a sponsorship, and I think he was pretty near finished his first year, and he'd started paying it back, actually, because he decided he wanted to pay us back for the budget that we'd lent him. Doing really well, and he got this phone call from another service provider to say that somebody had dropped out in the painting and decorating course, and did he want to actually to take it up, and he said no, he was fine doing his degree in art and design, and wouldn't be interested really in going on the painting and decorating course.
So when Pat told me that story, it just really strikes me that we often really limit people, and we don't really support them to deliver their ambitions, because we put them into a homeless box, or, you know, actually this person is homeless, they need to access a homeless service or a homeless support group or whatever, when actually what they need is a friend, and maybe a bit of a shove with an arm around them to take steps, and like you say, a bit of financial assistance that they then chose to pay back, to get them into the place that they want to be.
Yeah. And these one-offs, because I mean, I think every organization has got their one-offs, but you know, we've got a young woman who's finished a politics degree in Cambridge. You know, we've got and it's not all doing really great things. It's you know, we've got a guy that had been diagnosed with clinical depression for 10 years, and we found out he was just grieving his wife. He gave up the medication, and he's off on holiday to Sri Lanka and Poland, and moved out of supported housing and got a job part-time in a pub. So his life changed significantly when he just had that different lens of, well, maybe I'm not ill, maybe I was just experiencing grief. So loads, you know, there's hundreds and hundreds of those sorts of stories of just listening to people and give them a shot at something different.
Thank you. Whoever's logged in as the Keep Well Collaborative, I'm going to ask you to come off mute and ask your question, because quite honestly, I don't understand it. You've asked the question, when the moral case for system change is still insufficient to transform legacy working, what other currency can drive the paradigm shift?
Hi, I'm so sorry. It's Sharon Collins from the Keep Well Collaborative. I was just really interested and curious about Robert's talk about a paradigm shift, not an innovation, not a a new way of working, but really changing the game. And I just wonder what, you know, when you talk to colleagues about the importance of transforming the way that the system works together, and legacy systems that hold people in homelessness, when you talk about the moral imperative for change, but that moral imperative still isn't sufficient to change the way that people are working. I just wonder if there's any other sort of currency, you know, other than cash and commissioning models, that can actually drive change in a very sort of transformative way. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, because it's often blows me away with the fact that moral argument isn't enough. So increasingly we talk a lot about the idea of whether we need to influence and try and convince as many people as possible, or whether the only way to truly influence is influence through doing. So we're trying to create ways in which we can use the PTS response within the system that we've got, using this new system alliance to learn and communicate, to try and ultimately prove that if you approach in this way and deliver a PTS response in this way, then whatever your outcomes metric might be, we get greater success. So trying to just prove that there is better often can be enough to convince people to listen and take note. But we've talked a lot about the idea of just forgetting everybody and doing our own thing over here, and hope that people will join because they see that it's better. So that's really hard, because people are incredibly invested in their interventions and their new ways of thinking and new evidence, that it becomes very personal. And if you challenge that stuff, then it elicits, sometimes elicits some negative reaction. You just look at my Twitter feed and see what people say. I mean, if you challenge the status quo too much, there's a lot of people invested in it. And part of the learning from our wisdoms from the system asks the question. A lot of people would be out of a job if we really did solve homelessness. So it is about questioning that motivation and really asking what we're trying to achieve. And Mayday changed their mission, and we're now looking at ending the systemic institutionalization of people going through tough times, taking people out of the system. It's not about ending homelessness, it's about changing that lens, and hopefully people will see that we're onto something and join us with that.
That's really powerful, and I think it is, it goes back to my community development days. My job is to work myself out of a job. I should not be needed. And if we lived in a fair and just society, the homeless sector wouldn't be needed. I've just been having a quick flick through folk who are on. Sorry, I always do this to people. I pick on people, I know. We've got Nigel Hewitt on, who's the chair of the Faculty of Inclusion Health, and Caroline Schulman, who's just the most amazing GP. I just wondered if either of you two wanted to just come off mute and give us your reflections on kind of what you've heard.
Hi, yeah, Nigel here. Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm just sitting here wondering, whether I'm somebody who is too invested in the current system to be ready to embrace change, which is probably to some extent true. So I'm still processing this, and trying to think how to take it forward. I guess one of the difficulties is the challenge of we know the whole of society's systems are dysfunctional at the moment. So we've got lots of new people coming onto the streets who are who don't have complex problems. They're just poor and didn't have any savings, and now their job's gone. And the system isn't responding to those people. And of course, if it doesn't respond to them, they'll gradually find ways of dealing with their distress, which will undoubtedly make them mentally unwell and physically unwell, and they'll develop addictions, and then they will happily fit into the category of people that I've spent my life learning how to help. Yeah, and so I think this is interesting and it's challenging, and the question is, how do we get from here to there? And I don't know the answer to that question.
Thanks, Nigel. Caroline, I wondered if you had any reflections. I'm just struck that a lot of the conversations you and I have had have been very focused about a strength-based approach, and certainly that your work around end of life and palliative care, absolutely starting from what matters to people.
Yeah, no, thanks, Olivia, and thanks. Oh gosh, it's been amazing. I've absolutely loved hearing you, Pat and Robert. Really, it's been extraordinary. And I suppose I totally I totally hear you and totally agree, actually, that we are so, we are fixers. We've gone through life, I think you go through medical school, you go through your professional life at actually trying to fix people. And it's really struck me how wrong that has been in the last number of years since I've been working more and more looking at people who are potentially even approaching the end of their life, as Olivia said, and we're actually there. People can't be fixed, but what you can do is empower people to actually have. You can explore with people what's important to them, and I think it's what is actually living well, and where are your strengths, and what is important in terms of the future. It's not being barraged every time you see a professional to about your drinking, about how you're going to stop this and stop that in the way that I think most consultations with professionals are actually when people have addiction. So I think I totally see that, and but the whole system, as you say, needs to be transformed, because we shouldn't be working in this way. We shouldn't. I mean, the people that I work with are institutionalized. They've been in homeless services often for decades, and they're really very, very physically unwell. But yeah, so if we could start this whole approach of actually, and I had a number of patients earlier on when I was working in primary care, where absolutely the fundamental thing I would be trying to explore with them is what they want to do, what they're good at, and getting people enrolled into different opportunities. And one of my most successful I would still remember to this day is getting, somebody who was a really entrenched rough sleeper, initially didn't want to go into any accommodation, and he ended up basically a sound engineer. And it was that sort of helping but there's so few opportunities at the moment to actually access and get people supported to do what they're good at and what they really want to do. So yeah, I mean, power to you, and I've certainly joined your alliance. So but
that's
thanks.
Brilliant.
Thanks so
and
much.
Sorry, Nigel and Caroline, sorry for putting you on the spot, but I just think there are so many similarities between the principles that you've developed in the faculty and what the sort of, I suppose, the world that Pat and Robert are describing.
I mean, I guess to come in and on a couple of those points. I mean, we're we've deliberately positioned ourselves as an organisation to be independent and to allow ourselves to talk openly and challenge some of the things that we see, and we rely on trusts and people away from those commissioning budgets, so that we can hold a mirror up to some of the pieces of work happening. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be people that are operating within the system that are also fighting for these things. And the work of Pathway and some of the stuff we've done before together, Caroline, I mean, it's really important that we continue to put this lens on things from within the system, as well as sitting outside of it, as we've positioned ourselves for as well. So, you know, and the bastion of my history education at the moment is coming from the Crown. And the episode the other day with the chap that broke into Buckingham Palace and spoke to the Queen, he sat in the chair and he said, I'm not depressed, I'm just poor. And we have to start looking at things through that lens and helping people understand that the system around them may be causing some of the things that are happening to them, and just trying to help them reflect on some of those things so that they are empowered to do it. But it's all very well us saying that we need to plug people into community. If the community's not there, then there's nothing to plug into. So there's a lot of work to be done on the wider community issue of the fact that things are being decimated more and more, and that's so much more relevant during times of COVID when everything's shut, and it shines a light on the fact that it's very hard to plug people into those community settings when everything's closed. But that's not to mean we shouldn't try.
So I have to tell you off, Robert, for the sport, you didn't introduce that Crown piece with a spoiler alert. So, you know.
Sorry. Well, he broke in. I think everybody knows that, don't they?
I'm going to draw us to a close, actually, and just say an enormous thank you to Pat and Robert, not just for sharing this work with us, but for the work that you're doing. I utterly applaud you. Thank you so much. We have recorded this. We will share the recording, and so hopefully you can share it. Maybe you could, as commission, I know there's a few commissioners listening in. Maybe you could have a sort of a commissioners huddle about how do we think about this. And I do know that Pat and Robert and others would be really happy to follow up with people. So thank you all so much for your time. It's been utterly inspiring listening to you. You've described a different future.
Thank you for giving.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks a lot.
Pat, Robert,